Hello, everyone. I'm Mark Fowler, CEO at the Tanenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding, and it is my great pleasure to bring you this session with Jörg Schmitz on religion, culture, and the organization. So just so you have a little bit of background, Jörg and I met a few years ago at each of us doing separate work for the same partner. And I remember seeing Jörg's presentation and was only able to catch the very beginning of it because I had to catch my plane, and remember thinking that was some of the best thought I had seen around DEI work in a long time. And I believe personally that when we talk about religion in the workplace or even religion more broadly, that we really are talking about sometimes influences that are beyond our view. And so Jörg and I have spoken a couple of times, and some of you may know that Jörg is also an anthropologist, and looking at and locating religion and culture, and even religion and culture as it relates to DEI work in an anthropological framework, I think provides some insights for us in the ways in which we think about the work we do, what we even call challenges, and then what the really rich opportunities are for us to embrace religious diversity as part of DEIB strategy. So I'm going to turn this over to Jörg Schmitz. You can see his full bio on the platform. You should know that Jörg is the managing director at Thomas Leland and is also managing partner, at Thomas Leland, and is director of the Inclusive Leadership Institute, which is another offshoot and program of Thomas Leland. So I am going to try and be quiet. Jörg and I have already talked about the fact that I'm going to probably jump in with some questions periodically, but I'm now going to turn this over to my friend Jörg Schmitz.
Thank you so much, Mark. And you don't have to be quiet at all. In fact, the best thoughts we develop in dialogue, and so I'm looking forward to this dialogue. And actually, I wanted to thank you for extending this invitation, and also for encouraging me to actually represent a little bit of that anthropological perspective in this conference, because as you know, I'm very passionate about this. I believe that when it comes to DE&I, anthropology has a lot of value to add. And perhaps also in this conversation about religion and in organizations and in a DE&I context. Just briefly, for anybody who's tuned in right now, my background is, I've done a lot of different things as an anthropologist, and I'll invite you to become a little bit of an anthropologist in the next hour or so when we're doing this. But just so that you know, I've also done a lot of DE&I work over the past 25 years or so, with an anthropological perspective, granted, and religion has been part of that practice as well. Probably, as you can guess, not a main focus of mine, but as an anthropologist, it is a very important focus, actually, and that's hopefully maybe we can bring in and connect a few thoughts and dots and so forth. But I thought a great way to start, Mark, would be simply to explain what an anthropological perspective actually is, because when I mention that I'm an anthropologist, I always assume people know what that means. And I've come to learn that there are really two associations people have with anthropology. One is Indiana Jones, right?
Yeah.
And I am no Indiana Jones in any stretches of the imagination. The other one this is the question I usually get, oh, that's really interesting. Are you going on a dig anytime soon? So people think I'm an archaeologist and excavating dinosaur bones or something like this. So neither of them is true. But what I'd like to share, and I have a few slides here, but the slides are only accidental. They're just here to kind of facilitate a conversation. So what is an anthropological perspective? So anthropology, first of all, is a science, a social science. And even that statement is contended because some people say, where is the science in anthropology? And, you get into all kinds of interesting debates there. I consider it a science the way most sciences are. They're helping us to understand phenomena out there in the world. We are taking a little bit of a detached view on those things, just like a biologist is putting things under microscopes or puts things in some test situation. And anthropology is a little bit like that, except we don't have laboratories and we don't have testing equipment. What we have is ourselves and the world out there, and we kind of try to observe it the best as possible. So what is anthropology? Anthropology is the study of what makes us human. And that means that we take a broad approach to understanding the various different aspects of the human experience. And I should say this is really important. This is also for me the connection to DE&I work, that human diversity is in a sense the central focus of anthropology. So if you want to study something about human diversity, in fact, from a biological perspective, from a social perspective, from a cultural perspective, then anthropology is your science. What anthropology also does, anthropologists are the type of people who then say, I want to understand a particular type of the human experience, so let me immerse myself in it. Let me live with the people who I'm interested in. And so I become, no pun intended, I'm a non-native speaker of English, but I become the tool of kind of studying what it's like to be the other. And that is really all you learn when you become an anthropologist. How to understand what it's like to be the other. This is the only question you really need as an anthropologist. What is it like to be you? What it is like to be this part of that group of people? How does the world look when you're one of them? And then there are two different ways of thinking, and I say this purposefully because I'm going to invite you to take that anthropological perspective on the phenomenon of religion, actually, and by the way, on culture as well, but religion primarily because that's what we're doing here. And then we can take a loop and talk about how that might be interesting to DE&I work and so forth. But there is a distinction that is very dear to anthropologists, which is the distinction between emic and etic perspectives. And this may seem a little bit theoretical, Mark, but I'm sorry, but that's all part of
this is why
anthropologists talk in funny ways. But so emic is the answer to the question, what it is like to be them. What does it feel like to be them? It's that the subjective experience of being another. And then there is the etic perspective, and that is a comparative perspective, right? This is more the scientific, the clinical view. Okay, if we compare this group with the other group, what is happening there and how do they compare, and what general statements about the nature of a phenomenon can we make, in this case, religion.
And Jörg, would you say then that broadly speaking, in the field of DEIB, whether it's about religion or another identifier, that we find ourselves moving back and forth between these two, and maybe sometimes actually talking about one but meaning the other?
Correct. And that's why this is the first, I think, value that anthropological, even language can offer, that the D&I space is toggling back and forth between those two things and confusing also the recipients of the DE&I work sometimes with switching perspectives. And there is perhaps a natural progression. Oftentimes, the first generation DE&I work has been very much focused on etic dimensions, right? Mm-hmm. Let's compare this group with that group, the experience of men and women, and we do a lot of quantitative analyses and we compare. That's an etic perspective. And then now recently, we have actually linked it to the emic perspective, and that's when, of course, we focus on subjective experiences and how do we shift and change subjective experience. And we find sometimes that one can explain the other, but sometimes they're both speaking a different language. It's a different, literally a different point of view, a different perspective. So hopefully that's interesting. By the way, that definition comes from the American Anthropological Association. I love what Gillian Tett, who is also the editor of the Financial Times, by the way, has written. She's an anthropologist. So anthropology is actually really useful as people are discovering more recently, especially in corporate contexts. But I love this way of framing what anthropologists do. We make the strange familiar. This is the mission statement of an anthropologist. We make the strange familiar. The practice or the phenomenon that seemed so distant all of a sudden becomes intelligible to us. We can relate to it. And we make the familiar strange, and that's really, really important, that we somehow enable people to look at themselves and their own practices through a very different lens, only to enrich the broader understanding of the world and themselves. And that's my mission here a little bit in this, using an anthropological perspective on religion to perhaps enrich all of our perspective a little bit on this phenomenon of religion in general, in the workplace, in our organizations, in our DE&I work. By the way, the idea of social silence is important, and the topic of religion is, of course, surrounded by social silence, right? And we can talk about a little bit why that is so. It is such, and this is where I'm just going to add a couple of thoughts here, but from an anthropological perspective, one of the things that concerns you to identify human universals, what do we all share? Anywhere in the world, globally, what is universal about us as human beings? And where are we different? And then, of course, why are we different and how does that matter? But also, how does the similarity, the universal, how does it get talked about, narrated, and those kind of things? Religion or spirituality is a human universal. There is no culture, no group of people that does not have religion or what resembles religion in terms of some degree of spirituality. And that's a really important part, because when we don't bring religion into our workplace conversations about the human experiences at work, and that's the trend right now, right? I mean, you see conferences humanizing the workplace and those kind of things. If we humanize it, but we do not bring religion into that conversation, we are missing a huge part of the universal makeup of the human experience. Religion at the same time, I mean, and you see some statistics here, and this is not about statistics inherently. I think we kind of all know that there are different religions out there in the world. And what is listed here is only actually, we oftentimes tend to think about the big religions out there. But religious diversity is just that. It's extraordinarily diverse, and it exists in facets and nuances. It's almost a crime, anthropologically speaking, to just put Christianity there and Islam and Hinduism, because each of them has a tremendous diversity, and that shouldn't be underestimated. The idea of Chinese folk religions is problematic as well in this source, but I took this obviously from somewhere, or ethnic religions, because in a sense we are all ethnic. If we use the term ethnic, we are all ethnic, right. And so these are all ethnic religions, right? Or these are all folk religions, even though some are bigger, others smaller, more or less institutionalized. But the degree of religious diversity is tremendous. Religion, of course, is not just religion. This is the other part of religious diversity. Religion is also a core element of our social identity. And and this is partially because religion has never just been about a belief system. It's also been about the group of people that subscribes to this particular religious belief system or carries it, and how that determines their relationship to other groups. So when you look into history, we're not just we're not just looking at religion in a kind of, like different, what would you call them? Tennis balls or so that are floating around. They're not just different things. They actually interact with one another in oftentimes painful ways and painful histories. I mean, I have to mention, because I'm in Germany and I'm German, that the Holocaust was, had a direct religious target, right? Even though it was less the religion and more the historical context and the people and the ideology. What's happening?
That led them to take the axe against the Jewish people.
That's right. That's right. When you think about Hinduism and the current debates and discussions around social identity of a nation in India, for example, and the painful and difficult relationships with Islam, there's another example, a historical example that led to political tension, partition, and so forth. This is where all of those questions are not just questions of belief or of religion. They're actually related to social and political dynamics, and sometimes economic dynamics, and so forth. So religion is never just religion. I guess that's the message around this as well. And because it's never just about religion, we almost need to think of religion as a marker of our cultural identity and a way of talking about who is part of our group and who is part of another group. Religion, in many respects today as well, serves as a trust sensor. Can you trust people of a similar faith? Faith and sharing faith, even economically in history, was a way of saying, I can trust you, I can do business with you. And oftentimes, even today, entire professions or so have a religious strand. So there is actually a really interesting learning around the role of religion in our social context and for ourselves. So these are, by the way, all what we call markers of identity or belonging. Sometimes it's around nationality, sometimes it's around ethnicity, race, certainly, but also other elements of tribe, caste, or class. And sometimes those get conflated. It's very interesting what is happening in Europe right now around discussions in many different countries around the linkage of Christianity to nationality. Similar in the United States, you have some of those tendencies, right?
Yeah.
And so there is a sense of religious essentialism that at least that's how we would talk about it, around notions of nationality.
And then those also lead to the ideas of trust.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
And become part of narratives around who can we trust, who don't we trust.
Yes, and
within
also,
the country and outside.
That's right. And also a threat that we may perceive around our own identity. And you see this around Islam and Christianity in Europe right now, even though I would say that many European environments, unlike the United States, are not as religious, overtly religious. It's a very secular environment, but not when it comes to using for example, Islam as a way of othering fellow citizens. Right? So all of a sudden, that religious divide matters, even to people who are not nominally religious. So religion is a marker of social identity as well.
Great. I know I've seen the slide, so I know what's coming, so I'm just going to be quiet.
Well, I'll make this also very quick because I know the slides that you like. But I also want to make this practical. I mean, I know that some of this can seem extremely, theoretical and academic sometimes. But sometimes academia is academic in order to derive some practical value out of it. So bear with the academic part of it. That's also part of diversity. Sometimes we need to allow a little bit of academic musing before we actually say, what does that mean and what actions can we take away? But think about it this way. Our individual sense of identity is layered, and religion layers into this. And I'll use myself as an example. So religion, to be very overt about it, is not a huge part of my social identity. I was raised in a family that was fairly agnostic, and that's how I describe myself religiously. I'm kind of an agnostic. But that only gets me so far. This is what I know about myself, what I realize about myself. Now, my family is also similarly agnostic in many respects. That's where I learned my agnosticism, in a sense, right? My social identity groups, some of those that I associate with are not religiously defined, but for others, they are, and that in the German context, that was either Protestant or Catholic. And where I grew up, I was right at the border of, Germany is the birthplace of Protestantism. So, it was kind of like at the boundary of Catholic South and Protestant North. But again, it did not feature in my social identity groups, but others that I grew up with certainly had that in their identity group. Religious affiliation then matters. Am I an official member of a religious institution? In Germany, for example, is one of the few places where you pay church tax, which I think was one of the reasons why my parents left the church, actually, because you have to go to a government office to declare your membership or to withdraw your membership in a particular church. Whatever church you belong to, they get tax money from the government. So the government collects money on behalf of churches here in Germany. So religious affiliation. Then there is obviously the country and the nation that we are born into. If you're born in India, you cannot escape the broader, national context of the religious context. If you're born in China or in the Philippines, you cannot ignore the country norms around practicing religion. So in other words, religion is also not a choice. We're born into a particular tradition, a religious tradition, a cultural tradition that has a religious underpinning, even if we believe it or not. We don't have to subscribe and believe overtly into and in a particular religion in order to have been shaped by a religious context. And this is another important part why we cannot ignore religion as part of human diversity and our diversity work. It matters if you're raised in a Catholic context, a Protestant context, or different Protestant context, if you're raised in a Shinto tradition in Japan, or a Confucian tradition in Korea, or an Islamic tradition in any of the Muslim countries around the world. It changes your worldview and your outlook, even if you are not officially subscribed to that particular religion.
And would you also say, Jörg, that the whole idea of the social identity, because we do work around social identity as well at Tanenbaum, and we're very keen to talk about the dynamic when a social identity becomes salient and becomes impactful on the other identifiers, or at least becomes the lens through which we process the circumstances that we're in.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. It's a lens, but more important, and this is what this, and it depends on how you discuss social identity, but the social is actually in how you're being perceived. by others.
Mhm.
And this is as important as the kind of things that we claim or decide around our identity.
Yeah.
And so even the notion that we can choose our religious affiliation is historically relatively recent, right? Historically, your religious, affiliation was decided by you, by your family, by your cultural traditions, and leaving that was almost inconceivable, not even an option for many people.
I just want to add this comment as you continue, because I know that we'll get to this. But one of the audience members has added a comment that religion has also played a major role in distrust, particularly Christianity, the enslavement of Black and Indigenous people.
Absolutely.
And if we can discuss that and incorporate that, and I know that we are planning to do that.
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. I mean, whenever it is a trust vehicle, it's also a distrust vehicle. It goes hand in hand, because it's trust among some and distrust of others. It goes hand in hand. It's part and part. It's unfortunately part and parcel of this idea of trust. Just how today we, in the DE&I context, we talk about belonging, right? We don't talk about trust as much as we do about belonging. Perhaps we should talk about trust more, because we are also working in organizations that have no qualms about, divesting or letting people go and whatnot, and what happens to a sense of belonging when we make those decisions in our organizations, right? So there is a direct corollary, but absolutely, religion is a source of trust and distrust, deep distrust.
I'm mindful of time, Jörg, so I'm going to stop interrupting you and let you get through the rest of this.
No worries. But I'll also make this really quick. I'm German. I should be time oriented, but anyway, that's a whole different story, Mark. But this statement is actually really important. Religious traditions are a powerful source of explicit and implicit associations. And again, in DE&I, we talk a lot about unconscious biases, right? And those manifest in our culture, in our patterns of behavior, our choices, regardless of whether we are religious or not, because we stand in a religious cultural tradition, right? And that religious cultural tradition, it has positive sides and also extremely ugly sides. After all, religion was also used to justify colonialism, justify the proselytization and the religious conversion of people. It's been able to justify slavery. We've justified all kinds of things through a lens of religion as well.
And throughout history.
And throughout history, of course.
Yeah,
and some would argue that that has been a central function of religion. I wouldn't argue that, by the way, but there is certainly an argument to be made, especially when religion becomes institutionalized and it becomes associated with a power structure. And European history is full of examples like that. Who divided the world between the Portuguese and the Spanish, for example? Right. The Pope. So religion as a social phenomenon, I hope that's what anthropologists tend to think about, right? Religion is, like other things, is a human universal, but it's also a social phenomenon. And how would we even define it? So one of my favorite anthropologists, Clifford Geertz, uses this definition: a cultural system containing narratives, symbols, practices, rituals that establish powerful moods and motivations by constructing and affirming a realistic order of existence. In other words, the world. And this may seem really academic and esoteric, but it's useful, I think, if we step away from this phenomenon that we are all invested in. That's why we are here. That's why you're doing what you're doing, Mark. That's why Tanenbaum exists. That's why you have this conference. if we, for the moment, even if it's just for this hour or the remaining 30 minutes, to look at it through as a social system, as a cultural system and a social phenomenon. What is the function? And this, when you do that, you step away and you study. Here is this group of people that call themselves humans, and they practice something called religion. Why? What does religion do for the people that are religious, or for this group of people, actually? And they're probably, and this is also across history, this is nothing new. There's, this is just when we take that broad anthropological view. What are the essential functions of religion? First of all, as we said, religion was a powerful source of giving us identity. Today, it is one of many things that can give us identity. That wasn't so across all of history. There were times in human history where religion was perhaps our only meaningful sense of identity when we are encountering others. And in that sense, it's a really important phenomenon. Today we have all kinds of other institutions. We have a passport, we have a notion, a sense of nationality, or an identity card that doesn't list religion on it. But think about how in human history we had to invent all of these things, right? So religion was and continues to be for many people a powerful sense of self and a powerful identity. We talked about community and social trust, right? It defines our community, belonging and safety, ultimately, right? And those are absolutely essential to the functioning of any human group, and we're kind of discovering this in the DE&I work, but anthropologically speaking, this is not a new thing. Belonging or safety, psychological safety are not new discoveries at all. They're just new to the DE&I conversation. Most importantly, religion also gives us meaning and the integration of our human experience. Think about there, again, universal experiences, like growing up, becoming an adult. Even though the ages differ, the rituals differ, but all of those things, transitions in our life, deaths, illness, all of the traumatic experiences are interpreted religiously. So it's not an accident why populations that have experienced heavy degrees of trauma, collective trauma, social trauma, have really needed religion to become that interpretation of their experience and a revalidation, and a rebuilding of identity, of community, all those other things, but again, also giving meaning and integrating that experience. It gives us a sense of moral and ethical orientation, and most importantly, it gives us actually a sense of motivation. Now, this is interesting, purpose. Think about, I don't know which organizations are part of this conference, but many of them have recently discovered that they need to or want to become purpose-driven organizations. Right? Religion knew a long time ago that purpose is perhaps one of the most powerful motivational drivers of human beings. We didn't need the modern organization to discover that. But it's really interesting that here we all of a sudden have corporations aspiring to doing something that throughout history we have not derived from work or companies, but we've derived it from religion.
And isn't it, would you say that with these 5 essential functions of religion in this space where companies are actually maybe refining or redefining altogether the function, the purpose, that all 5 of these functions also are present both in the DEIB structure, but also within the company itself.
Yes, 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 and yes. And you can even correlate that. And by the way, this is also different in various different countries around the world. We shouldn't assume that, just because companies are now, discovering these functions, that it's equally embraced everywhere in the world. But increasingly, it's organizations and corporations who have to almost fill a gap that people experience in other domains of the social world. When you think around, COVID has done, has added stress and strain on our societies, on our social systems. Social movements like Black Lives Matter and so forth have actually, highlighted specific gaps in society, right? And organizations are now responding to that. We see a polarization in societies all around the world. I mean, and so our societies are no longer functioning or filling some of the functions that religion has historically filled. And so organizations are doing that increasingly, even though that's not what they were built for originally. It's very interesting, A few years ago, I was part of the conference board, and that was we started to realize with all this purpose and emerging in organizations that here are companies built for profit that are now stepping into the functions that otherwise government or other social institutions had but are failing at. That's why I think it's so important that employees are expecting their employers, their organizations to develop a moral, ethical voice around social problems.
We have another comment that I want to add into the rest of our conversation, which is someone is asking, so is work, corporations, and organizations becoming a religion if they serve similar functions? And I would say, part of the data from our national survey a few years ago was the degree to which people were talking about religion. But if we look at these functions of religion, if we think about the presentation thus far, I think that there is an identity that one is expected to create and or maintain when you become a member of a workplace. Mm-hmm. There is belonging and safety that you are either experiencing, not experiencing, or as a manager, you become responsible for. There are beliefs and rituals around the way in which work can and should be conducted and the ways in which people are evaluated. There's, rituals beyond rituals. There are conduct expectations that are based in some morality, which may not be explicitly stated as religious, but I know you're going to talk about this on the next slide, and that there is motivation. And I would say that the motivations have probably been diverse as well, but I think more than it becoming a religion, it functions as one. Yeah. And so as a result, when we talk at Tanenbaum about embracing religious diversity, Imagine, Create, Build, our theme for this year, it's kind of with the idea that religion is not new to the workplace. The way in which we actually think about and assess, and to a certain degree, in some instances, are truthful with ourselves in the ways in which our businesses operate. Yes, it could look like Sunday morning for some people.
Yes, but this is actually, anthropologically, this is a beautiful observation that I think, without spelling it out, without making it part of the strategy, that organizations, are competing with religion. Of course they can't, because religion, while these may be important functions of religion, that's not all there is to a religion. And I want to be very clear. This may be, just because something has certain functions or fulfills certain functions doesn't mean that's all there is to it. The most important element of difference is actually the element of God, or the element of some deity or some power that resides outside, is out of our sense of control. organizations work in exactly the opposite way, where we are the agents, we create the future, we are the agents that move the world. In many religious traditions, that is almost a sacrilegious way of thinking. If you spell it out, if you think it to its extreme. It always reminds me of, I did a session in Saudi Arabia once on project management, and I got into this heated debate, and it was beautiful. And there was somebody who basically said, we talked about forecasting, you know, and it's something that we do in Western companies so easily. And he really took offense by the idea of forecasting. And he says, how can we even assume to know God, to know what God is planning? I always remember that because it was such a beautiful illustration of how religious thinking impacts things that we don't associate with religion, you know, forecasting, planning, those kind of things. But there is a tension there, you know, there is an underlying belief system around agency in the world and what is controllable and what is not. So really interesting, almost philosophical discussions connected to this. But again, I'm just trying to illustrate an anthropological view of this as well.
Yeah.
So this is important. If motivation is a key factor, we cannot forget, and this is really important, that essential motivations and the way that our companies are built sometimes have a religious foundation. Even why do we work? Why do we work in organizations? Why do we work the way we work? And it's not a surprise, hopefully, to many that especially the US workplace is an inherently Protestant or an example of a Protestant work ethic on hyperspeed, hyperdrive. You know, this is why I love this quote here by Johnny Greenwood, right? I mean, just think about how true that is for many people, feeling guilty when we're not at work. How many of us here have left messages? Oh, I'm on vacation, but I'm checking emails. I'm checking voicemails once a day only, sorry. Well, I mean, you know, you don't find that as easily in countries or cultures that have a very different religious tradition. And there is no accident to this. You know, of course, it's not just Protestantism. It's, you know, when I talk to people, you know, for like a very close colleague who is Hindu, about Dharma and how that motivates her work ethic and her at work. So, but oftentimes, I mean, this is when we talk about organizations and why we work and what motivates us. You know, religion is not far from the answer, even if we don't have to be religious about it. So I'll use 2 more minutes and then I'll shut up. Sorry, I can.
Fantastic. It's fantastic, Jörg.
What I think is important, especially when we have when we try to have conversations about religion in a DE&I context and around these kind of things, it may be useful. Again, this is a bit of an anthropological stepping back, looking at religion as a phenomenon. But, you know, there are those, you know, I mean, this is why I call it the spectrum of religious commitment, right? There are those that are clearly tied and identified with a religious orthodoxy or doctrine or interpretation. And, you know, and for people on that side of the spectrum, a lot of things that I may have said may be deeply disturbing or objectionable, you know, to even look and put that kind of critical distance on it, right? Then there are people, you know, like myself, or, you know, who may find it easier to talk about religion because I am not connected to, tied to, affiliated with a particular religious commitment, but I am influenced by a religious tradition, which in my case is this odd blend of Catholicism and Protestantism in many respects. I work like a Protestant, but anyway, so it's even,
I want to hear the second part of that statement.
In the middle is this association with a religious tradition, but it's not such a deep faith or a deep source of identity. It's oftentimes kind of common practices, we celebrate some holidays or whatever it is, but it's not such a deep commitment that we have. And again, this is a spectrum, so there is a range. Right.
Very wider than the screen everyone is looking at this on, and considering that there's so much diversity within these experiences. And I would also suggest that you can move on this spectrum over the course of your life. So wherever you happen to be at this moment right now, doesn't mean that that's going to be the way it is for the rest of your life.
Yes. But see, that's the power of using a tool like this to actually start a conversation about religion, because it acknowledges the different sentiments, moods, and attachments we have to specific religious belief systems or religious practices and so forth. And it helps us to maybe identify this. And this is where, apart from the specific content of religions, this is where the tension resides. Right? Is my religious identity that might be core to my experience, is that even recognized or seen in my organization by my team members? Is that important actually? Is this acknowledged? Right? And this is why I play around with these things sometimes a little more. By the way, I can't help but have a quote by Margaret Mead in a presentation, also an anthropologist, of course, one of the more famous ones. And this is important because this also impacts how we behave around religion, by the way. But this, to me, now this is my last slide, but it might be useful to think about yourself. Where are we on that spectrum? Where are my team members on this spectrum? And sometimes we simply don't know because religion has been a taboo of conversation, which is also part of our cultural makeup. And that's not an accident. We need to go back to 1723 to understand why religion is a taboo in our societal contexts. And it's not like that everywhere, by the way. But then our organizations are also more or less religious, right? They also have an explicit or not so explicit religious commitment. And there are organizations that are very overt in their religious commitment and others that stay away from it. And so you get this, this different orientation in our DE&I practices even around how do we actually acknowledge and treat religion as part of our DE&I work. And I'll stop there because I think this hopefully makes sense to people that we get into different domains. The one that worries me the most is where religion is a taboo in the workplace, and where religion is minimized, ignored, or excluded from the conversation, or perhaps just a blind spot that we are not aware of. Those are all the ways that DE&I work needs to fill, but it needs to be done really sensitively. And again, I believe that taking a step back and using an anthropological perspective on religion can actually help us frame a better conversation about religion in the workplace.
And I would agree. I mean, I think that, Tanenbaum is 30 years old. Our workplace work is 25 years old. 25 years of the 30 years we've been in existence, we've been working with corporations, large not-for-profits, et cetera. And I can definitely attest to when religion is minimized, it's sometimes almost more damaging than when it's taboo.
Yes.
Because there is almost an acknowledgement of someone's core identity and a dismissal of it.
That's right.
Great. So we have about 8 minutes left. Have one more comment here. I think there's often stigma attached to openly sharing one's religious affiliation at work. Holding, practicing, making decisions based on one's spiritual beliefs can make you look unprofessional, archaic. How do we help break this stigma? What would you say to that? I have a thought, but what would you say?
Well, what would I say? It's a great question, but I would also offer maybe the perspective, this is no different from other stigma, right? I mean, whether we are working on removing stigma for people with disabilities, whether we are removing stigma for people based on their sexual orientation, whether we're removing stigma that's gender-based, you know, the removal of stigma is an important part of DE&I work. It needs to be done inclusively, though. I mean, it needs to be done very sensitively, and and because religion has been taboo for a very long time, we probably need to look at what have we learned from. I mean, even discussing race in the workplace, you know, I mean, is a relatively new phenomenon. Race has been in the workplace ever since there have been workplaces, but the discussion about it hasn't happened, and so it's no different from that, I think. And again, this is where hopefully the vocabulary of DE&I can help. There are unconscious biases associated with that. Let's talk about that. Let's, as a D&I practice at the organizational level, that's where we need to prepare the organization so that people feel encouraged to actually talk about and disclose their religious affiliation and what it means to them, and get validated for that. But that's why DE&I work is so important, but we need to prepare it at the organizational level.
And I was going to say, I mean, to your point, I think that there are two tracks for this. The first is for the person who is making decisions using spiritual beliefs or based on one's spiritual beliefs, the degree to which you can own that.
Yes.
And it sometimes takes something to actually be able to explain to someone, not to try and convince them, but to actually explain to them, this is how I organize every aspect of my life, including work. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't mean that everyone has to agree. But I do think that we want to take some time to think about how do we present this information in the midst of no agreement? Mm-hmm. Because often the best ideas have been the ones voiced by the person who seemed like they were archaic and unprofessional. And by the way, now, as a result, nobody changes your linens every day if you stay in a hotel unless you ask them to. And then I do think, to your point, that we want to, I think, and certainly we're committed to this work at Tanenbaum, and I know you are as well, which is to give people more context of the way in which religion is and has always been present in the manner of work.
Yes.
That this is nothing new, that you want to, you know, that you're actually kind of like, you had a moment and you went inside and you saw a possibility, whatever it is, whatever language it is, none of this is new. Just as that example that you spoke about in terms of the gentleman who's kind of like, why would we forecast anything? We can't speak for God. Why would we do that? And my guess is that business is still operating and that they were doing okay before you got there.
Yes. They're doing just fine without forecasting.
Well, so we are almost at time. Let me just ask you one final thought. What's the thing that you would want people to walk away from this conversation? And what's the next thing you would hope people would do?
Well, that's a tough one, but I would think that, I mean, religion does not have to be a taboo topic. And I think this is, and if we are a DE&I practitioner of sorts in our companies, we need to make room for the exploration of religion. If we truly want to build a workplaces where the human experience is at the center. And that, you know, no doubt, this is why the spectrum is important. You know, depending on where we sit on the spectrum, the conversation may be easier or more difficult, or we have traps of oversimplification or minimizing. But just like any other of the DE&I topics and challenges we are picking up, this is a really important one because it is a human universal and it touches on the core, I mean, even just the core functions of what it means to be human in groups. You know, and I think the last question kind of is the one, I mean, to be courageous around it, you know, to start conversations, to be curious. And sometimes that curiosity, if we think a little bit like an anthropologist around it, that makes things a little easier. It's a phenomenon. It's an experience of someone else. Let me explore that. Let me understand that. Not to convince, not to change, but just to understand. And that act is so important. And that's what we can give to each other. And because it's such a human universal.
So Jörg, I see this as the beginning of far more work that we will do together in the future, but I thank you so much for making the time, for sharing these models and structures and this context, which I really do believe can help to expand all of our work around building inclusion around religious diversity, embracing religious diversity in all of our workplaces. So thank you so much for joining us for this year's summit.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Mark.
And thank all of you for joining us. And I hope that you have a wonderful rest of the conference with our next session.